because of what his work was among them. This word. So he tells them, I want you to regard me as a servant of Christ, a steward of the mysteries of God. That is a very loaded verse. There is a lot in there. There's a lot in what it says, and then in comparison to this world, there's a lot it doesn't say. There's a lot that is said there that it very much conflicts with this world. What you will often find with a lot of churches today, mega churches, that often will emphasize their pastor. It is his church or her church. I saw it where I used to live in Bourbon County. There were 2 mega churches there, on the Bourbon County standard. And it was all about their pastor. Everybody was a part of that church. This was so-and-so's church. Is that what you find here in 1 Corinthians? Is that the attitude? Mm-hmm. Well, no, I'm looking now at this attitude that Paul talks about here in chapter 4. But I mean, that was a problem, that division that existed because of that fleshly thinking. This problem is also going to be this kind of fleshly thinking. But when Paul says, regard us as a servant of Christ, what's the spirit behind these mega churches, which is all about their pastor? What role does the pastor have to that church? Is he or she a servant? No, in fact, it's kind of the opposite. That church belongs to them. That's both their attitude and the attitude of the people who are part of that church. This is so-and-so's church. Whatever the pastor does, the church follows that guidance or follows that lead, follows that control, if you would. So many times what you end up finding, let's say that pastor turns out to have some sort of immorality. Those churches often dissolve because everything is revolved around that pastor, who is the head, very much the head of the church. But we can also see this even in what we might consider more the ecclesiastic churches that may not have one leader locally, but in fact, they're going to have a large group, maybe one or a large group of leaders who have absolute control over the church, like a college of cardinals, a pope, a band of apostles, modern day apostles that rule the church. Again, this is an absolute sense of rule, an absolute sense of authority. What we don't see is a spirit of servanthood. Instead, we see this idea of leadership, control. But that's not what you see with Paul. Paul says, regard me as a servant. But now let's get just a little bit closer. What about the attitude of we hire a servant to work for us? I dare say there's a lot of churches we might feel comfortable with that have that attitude. We hire somebody to work for us. We hire a preacher to do our preaching for us. Is that what Paul says here? What's he say? Regard me as a servant of Christ. Is there a difference in being a servant of the local church or a servant of Christ? Yeah, there's a huge difference. Because what we're talking about is a servant-master relationship. Who is the master? And it better be Christ. And that's the point that Paul wants us to understand, wants the Corinthians to understand, and he wants us to understand, is this idea that we need to regard those who are working in the gospel as servants of Christ. But then he goes on to modify that, or to add to that idea. He also says, as stewards of the mysteries of God. Now, this connects us with the previous section. I said if you're reading from Paul, you've got to see connections back and forth. He does that all the time through his writings. We saw back in chapter 3, he talked about the idea of the mystery of God. A mystery that had previously been unknown, but has now been revealed through the Spirit with these spiritual words. And he says, I want you to regard me as a steward of those mysteries. What is a steward? It's an interesting word. We don't use it a lot in our culture. We use the word stewardship, I think, probably more often. But what is a steward? I told you in our first class that we would kind of take time in every one of these studies and do kind of a topical study. That's what we're doing right now. What is a steward?
Sometimes got to do with somebody that trusted.
Yeah, I like that. Doing something, having a responsibility, maybe is a good way, a responsibility of something that belongs to somebody else, but you've been given the responsibility of doing that. One of the first jobs I had in college to help pay my way through school was to be an assistant manager at a fast food restaurant. And that picture is kind of close to what's involved in doing something like that. You've got 1,000 different jobs that you're doing. At the end of the day, it was my job to measure the food that was left over, to count the money, to see how, whether we used too much food or too little food, make sure all the money balanced out the way it was and that somebody wasn't sticking it in their pocket and walking out the door with it. How much of that was mine, but actually belonged to me? Not a bit of it. But if we were short on food, somebody's been putting too much in the tacos. I used to work for Taco Tico. So if somebody was putting too much meat in the tacos, at the end of the day, if we're short on food, who would the owner come to find out what's going on? That was me. That's what a manager is, a steward. The steward is responsible for those things that have been given to him, and he's responsible to demonstrate how did he take care of them? How did he use them? We find some examples of that in the scriptures. The story of Joseph. We all know the horrible situation where his brothers were so outrageously jealous of him, they wanted to kill him. Instead, they sold him as a slave into Egypt. And they had no idea what happened to him after that. But we find out that he was bought by Potiphar. And Potiphar made him a manager of his household. In fact, we're told that he gave him oversight in everything in his household. How much of that belonged to Joseph? Not one bit. How much responsibility did Joseph have? A lot. He had tremendous responsibility. We can find some other examples of it. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells a parable about an owner who's leaving to go on a long distance trip. He calls 3 of his slaves and he makes them managers, stewards. He gives them a sum of money, tells them he's going to be gone, and he wants an accounting of that when he returns. One of them took what he was given and doubled it. Another one took what he was given and doubled it. A third one took what he was given and protected it, but did nothing with it. And when the owner returned, he called him a wicked manager, a wicked, lazy slave. because he didn't do anything with that which he was given. Paul says, regard me as a steward of the mysteries of God. So what was Paul's responsibility? What's his responsibility to God? Yeah, he's got to use that word. That brings us back to where we are in Corinth. If there were people that were attacking Paul, what they're doing is trying to destroy his stewardship. And that's why Paul is going to stand up against that. Because I'm a servant of Christ. This is the treasure that God has given me. And he expects me to be using it. So he's not going to let anybody in Corinth silence him on that. So that's why he says, regard me as a steward of the mystery of God. John the Baptist is another great example of that. Remember when the disciples of John came to him and said, everyone's going to Jesus to be baptized. They've stopped coming to you. What's John say? He must increase, I must decrease. This is my stewardship. This is what he came to do. He came to point people to Jesus. And John was very good at the role that he was given, at fulfilling the role that he was given. The fact that his disciples had said, everyone's going there, John says, yay, that's my job. It's working. It's exactly what it's supposed to be. John didn't care about himself. He cared about the mysteries of God. And so that's the attitude we find with Paul. He says, regard me as a servant of Christ, a steward of the mysteries of God, recognize that all of this is for his master. Now, how do we apply that to ourselves? How should you regard yourself? Is it really any different? You may not have the same role. In fact, probably don't have the same role that the Apostle Paul had. But do you have that same treasure? The mystery of God? Do you have the same master, Christ? We each need to regard ourselves as servants of Christ, as stewards of the mysteries of God. And so what does Paul say there? In verse 2, in this case, moreover, it's required of stewards that one be found trustworthy. What does it mean to be trustworthy? It means at the end of the day, when you balance out the money, it comes out balanced. When you measure out the food, it comes out the amount that it's supposed to be. It means that when God asks, what have you done with that which I gave you? You don't have dirt in your hands where you just unburied it and brought it to him. Instead, it means that you can come to your Lord and say, Lord, you gave me this, and I've used it for your service. That's what it means to be trustworthy. But let's go a little deeper. What does that mean with the Corinthians and Paul? Because that's what this was, is they were attacking him, attacking the way that he did his work there in Corinth, at least some of them. When I say they, it never means every single one of them. But there were some that were attacking him. And essentially, what is Paul saying there in verse 3? What does he say about the fact that they were sitting in judgment of his work as a servant of Christ? Almost sounds just a little bit insulting, doesn't it? He says, it's a very little thing to me that you judge me. Why was it a very little thing to him?
They're not qualified.
I like that phrase. They're not qualified. They're not the master. And so if someone is not qualified, is trying to give their judgment, that should be a little thing. I mean, if you've got something, some sort of something in your body's just not working right. Somebody just walks by you at the grocery store. Oh, I can see you're in pain. Let me tell you what's wrong with you. How serious are you going to take that? At least I'm going to say, well, can you tell me what medical training you have to know this? Can you tell me what experience? Can you tell me why I should listen to your judgment in this matter? That's why Paul explained, I'm a servant of Christ. So if you're seated in judgment of me as a servant of Christ, show me where you're Christ. Or I'm going to have to tell you, it really doesn't mean much to me what you're saying. He's not being rude. He's trying to get them to understand this idea. And I like Mike's phrase there, because what we find here, I believe ultimately in all these three chapters, is a series of poor judgments. What we find here in chapter 4 is a judgment where they should not be judging. I'll give you a hint. Chapter 5 is the opposite of that. They weren't judging what they should have been judging. And in chapter 6, I think they were using the wrong kind of judges. But let's stay here in chapter 4. Paul is essentially saying, this is not your judgment to make. And that obviously was a problem in Corinth, is they're making judgments that they should not be making. I find it interesting what Paul says in the last part, in verse 4. I'm conscious of nothing against myself, yet I am not by this acquitted. If Paul is saying it's not the role of the Corinthians to judge in verse 3, what's he saying in verse 4? Hey, he's really saying it's not my role either. Because the last part of verse 4, he emphasizes, this is the judgment of God. Now, that doesn't mean he can just do whatever he wants, say whatever he wants, and say it doesn't matter anyway. Now, he needs to do his job the very best that he can, to the best of the ability that God has given him. But ultimately, Paul is not going to go and either pat himself on the back and talk about how good he is, or get down on himself and saying, I'm not accomplishing what I want to accomplish. Instead, he's just going to keep doing his work. He's going to keep being a steward of that which God has given. Anybody have any questions or comments then down through verse 5? I want to make some practical applications, but first I want to see if we have any questions or comments. All right. Part of this came up because of the fact that Paul was a public speaker for the church there in Corinth. And obviously there were some people who didn't like that. Most likely didn't like what he was saying, but for whatever reason, they didn't like that. To make very practical application to ourselves today, do we sometimes judge our local preachers? Sure. It happens. It absolutely does happen. There are 3 books in the Bible that are excellent for anybody who is intending to proclaim the word of God, working with local churches, supported or unsupported. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. They're called the pastoral epistles, so that's because of the mistaken denominational concept of a pastor. But anybody who wants to proclaim the gospel needs to know those 3 books and study them often. But that's from the viewpoint of the person who's doing the speaking, who's going to be the preacher. I would suggest to you that just as important are local congregations that either have someone who is working with them on a regular basis or considering having somebody working with them on a regular basis. And I would argue this chapter might be the most important chapter in the entire New Testament to study. It's important to understand what our responsibility as a part of a local church, how we are to regard the man who is speaking for us. And again, that whether it's someone who is supported or who's not being supported. But as someone who's a steward of the mystery of God, this chapter and to some extent chapter 9 that we're going to look at a little later, I would say those 2 chapters are of extreme importance for us to be very familiar with. Perhaps because of the work that this congregation is doing right now, this is a fortuitous time that we're studying this. But I strongly recommend that you think of that in light of our current situation as we study these chapters. Does not mean that we just say, well, we're not going to judge them all. We're just going to hire the first person that comes along. No, the New Testament is filled with passages that talk about false teachers. What does the New Testament tell us about a false teacher? You cannot tolerate them, period. Just as a side note, the word false does not modify the teaching, it modifies the man. A false teacher is a false teacher because of who he is, not because of what he says. But we cannot tolerate false teachers. We cannot tolerate someone who's self-serving, fleshly thinking, or selfishness, as Nina talked about. We cannot tolerate someone who is divisive. We're going to see that in the next chapter, in fact. Someone who is divisive, you cannot tolerate those things. But if someone is stewarding the mysteries of God, it's not our job to sit in judgment and say, well, they could be more effective if they did this. Or, you know what, they're not very effective to me, so I don't like their style. Those are the things that we need to avoid. All right, anybody questions or comments then down through verse 5? All right, let's get into verse 6, because Paul is going to now make personal application of what he's been talking about. He says, I have applied these things figuratively to myself and Apollos. Again, he's tying us back to stuff he's already talked about. What did he say about himself and Apollos? I have what? What did he say about Apollos or about himself? I have watered, or I have planted, and Apollos has watered. One of the questions I asked you in the previous classes, which ones are more important? And I warned you then, I asked trick questions. What's most important? The one who causes the growth. That's God. So Paul and Apollos, in the eyes of Paul, are what? Nothing. They're equally nothing. So that's what he has figuratively applied to himself and Apollos. And now, what's the example he's saying to the Corinthians? Which one of you thinks of yourself as being more important? Which one of you thinks of yourself as being superior to another? What should they be thinking? We are what? Servants of Christ. Did this attitude ever exist among God's people before Corinth? There's 12 men I can think of that kind of had this same problem. In fact, more than one time in the ministry of Jesus did he catch his apostles arguing about which one of them was the greatest in the kingdom. So this isn't a new thing. Satan didn't come up with a new idea here. Oh, I think I'll try this one. This is a problem that's existed among God's people even when Jesus was walking among them. And it will continue to always be a problem until this world ends. But the answer is still the same. Stop making judgments where you don't have any authority or any right to make those judgments. And that applies just as much in the way you think of each other, think of yourself in comparison to another, as it did for the apostles arguing about which one's the greatest and who gets to sit at the right hand and the left hand of Jesus. So Paul says, I've applied this to Paul and Apollos as an example to you so that you don't become arrogant on behalf of one to another. Now, what would make them become arrogant? Oh, look at what I've got. We're going to see later that part of this was in the manifestation of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Some of them had various gifts of the Holy Spirit. Some maybe didn't have any at all or had different gifts. Which gift was the most important? What's the one I have, right? That was the attitude that existed in Corinth. Whatever gift I've got, that's the one that's the most important. What was Paul's question? What do you have that wasn't given to you? And that's pretty much the answer. They had nothing that had not been given to them. So then what makes them better? Nothing makes them better at all. I like a phrase that Paul uses here down in verse 9. I think God has exhibited us apostles, last of all, as men condemned to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. I believe what Paul is saying here is the apostles are God's last divinely inspired examples. Who had been the divinely inspired example before the apostles? In fact, maybe for the apostles. Jesus himself, Christ, exactly. And now these apostles, who had been trained by Jesus to carry on in his kingdom after he's left, that also means by setting the example. I'm just going to read through the thoughts that Paul talks about here, kind of read through it quickly. We are fools. We are weak. We are without honor, hungry and thirsty, poorly clothed, roughly treated, homeless, working with our own hands, reviled, persecuted, slandered, scum of the earth, dregs of all things, crucify them, crucify them. Whoops, I stepped just one step further. But didn't that sound like the life of Jesus? In chapter 11, Paul's going to say, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Not everything he imitated of Christ was necessarily pleasant. We need to recognize that not everything we're called to be as stewards of the mysteries of God is going to be pleasant. It's going to be hard at times. But what did he say there? It's required of stewards that they be found trustworthy. So when those times occur that you are hungry and thirsty, that you are poorly clothed, that you're roughly treated, homeless, that you're working with your own hands, reviled, persecuted, slandered, treated as the scum of the earth. Recognize you're following in the footsteps of your master. And indeed, you've been called into fellowship with Jesus. And as such, there's no greater honor in this world to be had than to walk in fellowship with Jesus in that also. Anybody with any thoughts or questions about what we talked about today? We'll kind of pick up at that point then for next week and continue on through chapter 4.